So this week we are looking at chapters 12 and 13. So we're looking at imperial ambitions, sectional crisis, sections meaning the North and the South, and the Civil War. And we're going to look at how expansion pushed the nation into war. So we're really tracing like a single chain of events. Westward expansion increases. That expansion raises a constant question, will slavery expand too? And when the nation can't answer that question peacefully anymore, the conflict turns into secession and civil war. So what we're going to do is start in the West. So claiming the West. After the 1830s, overland travel really starts to increase. And overland meaning like we're traveling by wagon, we're traveling by horseback, and sometimes that means we're even traveling on foot. If we can't afford a wagon, we can't afford any livestock to help us get there. So people moved because they believed the West offers opportunity. It had land, work, and a fresh start. And by 1860, hundreds of thousands have traveled on trails like the Oregon Trail, like the one in blue there on that map. But the journey is hard. Death, injury, and illness are common, and families face major risk. And even on the trail, traditional gender roles are strained. Women often had to take on these new responsibilities when men are injured or die, but their authority is still very limited. Now, add to all of that this major turning point in 1848 when gold is discovered in California, and this creates a population explosion almost overnight. And people from the United States and all over the world traveled there hoping to strike it rich, and thus we see the sudden migration intensifies a lot of conflict that is happening there. The people that are already living there, the Californios, local Indian nations, and earlier settlers, right? They had already been there. Remember, we had just gotten this territory from Mexico not very long, like the Treaty of 1848 is signed. So all of this is happening right at the end of the war too. And we see the new types of labor being created. Mining towns are full of men, and that creates demand for cooking, washing, and domestic labor. And some women find opportunity, but non-white women are often exploited. We also have Chinese migrants. They face violence and theft, and many turn to domestic service work to survive. So the West is not just open land, it's a crowded space where migration creates conflict. And as more settlers arrive, the U.S. government competes with powerful Indian nations for land and sovereignty. And also we see violence increasing, and settlers often do not distinguish between native groups. An attack by one group becomes an excuse to retaliate against others. In California, native populations collapse due to the violence, kidnapping, disease, and the destruction of land. And across the plains and Southwest, environmental change and political disruption weaken some native empires and intensify conflict among others. So we see expansion, it's not only about opportunity, it's also about dispossession. And here's the transition. Expansion also creates a political crisis because each new territory forces the nation to decide, free or slave. And the question is going to drive the politics of the 1850s. So we're here. Let's scroll down just a little bit. In 1849, California applies to enter the Union as a free state. Remember, it was under Mexican rule, and in Mexico, they had outlawed slavery a long time ago. So coming in, and they want to enter the Union as a free state. Southerners immediately protest because the balance of power in Congress matters. Henry Clay proposes what becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. And Henry Clay is a name hopefully you've heard over and over and over in the book. He's a senator out of Kentucky, I believe. And he is really the mastermind behind a whole lot of compromises and laws and policies that were started in the 1800s. This compromise that he comes up with, it admits California as a free state. It uses popular sovereignty, so let the people living there, they get to vote and decide, and other territories gained from Mexico. And it includes a new fugitive slave law. The slave law is old. This is just a re-up on the slave law. This is a huge moment because compromise is supposed to reduce tension, but one part of the compromise does the opposite. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthens enforcement. It makes federal power more visible in everyday northern life. And it puts free Black communities at risk because kidnapping and false accusations becomes an easier in practice. And the result is backlash. So you have more and more Northerners who were not abolitionists became angry because they felt like the federal government is forcing them to protect slavery and forcing them to like be on the lookout and to kidnap slaves. So resistance grows in the North, including strong involvement in escape networks like the Underground Railroad. So this compromise actually backfires in a good way. Slavery is terrible, so it backfires in a good way. And next we have anti-slavery sentiment becomes more popular and more emotional. There's this book that is written in 1852, and it's written by a white lady. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. It is a fictional book, but she uses real accounts, real stories that she's heard to put together this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it spreads anti-slavery ideas widely, especially among Northern readers. And it makes slavery feel personal and immediate to people who don't experience it directly. And at the same time, politics are changing. In 1854, look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen Douglas proposes this new law. To gain support for Transcontinental Railroad, he proposes popular sovereignty in new territories, even though these territories are north of the Missouri Compromise line. And we talked about that a couple of chapters ago. So this effectively invalidates the Missouri Compromise, and it reopens the slavery debate at full intensity. And Kansas becomes this test case. If you don't know where Kansas is, let me go up just a little bit. So here's Kansas right here. Below it is like Oklahoma, Texas. This is like the little part of New Mexico, and here's Arizona. So it's just a couple of states over from where we are. But pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fled into the territory to influence the outcome, and two rival governments form, and you're going to read about those. One, they even come up with their own, like they're trying to get the state constitution written first. And violence is going to escalate, and that's why they call it Bleeding Kansas. I mean, people are literally fighting in the streets. There is also, we'll talk about John Brown in just a minute and what happens with him. But in 1856, violence reaches the U.S. Senate where Representative Preston Brooks, he beats Charles Sumner, another senator, on the Senate floor with a cane. He beats him so bad, it causes him to go temporarily blind. And it takes him months to recover from this beating. And it's all because Charles Sumner was speaking out against slavery. He was like, slavery is wrong. And he also insulted Preston Brooks' cousin. And that's why Preston Brooks like goes after him and beats him up. But that's not supposed to happen on the Senate floor in the Senate chamber. Those are supposed to be men like above all others, right? Like holding the law. And what we see is them fighting each other. That's just one incident that we have that's very widely known. There are 68 other conflicts in the Senate chambers, like fistfights that are breaking out. So to the north, Sumner becomes a martyr, and to the south, Brooks becomes a hero. And that tells you how divided the country is becoming. People interpret the same event in totally opposite ways, right? We're seeing that more and more in politics today. Then comes a major legal debate. In 1857, the Supreme Court decides the fate of this man. His name is Dred Scott. The court argues that Black people are not citizens and cannot sue in federal court. And it also argues Congress has no constitutional authority to exclude slavery from territories. So the ruling in this case of Dred Scott suggests slavery can expand basically anywhere in the territories. So Dred Scott, you'll read more about him. There's also this really great crash course video. It's Black History Crash Course. But it talks about Dred Scott and how his master takes him in and out of free territory and free states. And then when his master dies, he's like, hey, according to the law, I resided in a free territory, so therefore I should be free. The court came back and said, no, because you're Black, you can't sue the court for anything. And we also don't even consider you a citizen. Excuse me? What about all the free Blacks that were citizens under the law? Now you've just said that any person of color is no longer a citizen? That's a huge moment. That's a huge legal decision that affects all people of color. That is why this decision is so monumental. So, many Northerners conclude slavery's power had reached the highest federal institutions, and the fear grows into a political shift. And we see new parties arising because of it. we see the Republican Party becomes a major force by opposing the expansion of slavery into Western territories. What I want you to remember, the Republican Party of the 1800s and the Republican Party of today are different. Republicans were anti-slavery in the 1860s. Democrats were pro-slavery. In the 1900s, we see a shift, and we see Republicans identifying more with the old Democrats, picking up the same ideology, and we see the old Democrats switching. So just know that there is a change in political parties that happens over, like really in the 1930s and 1940s is when that happens, when they switch. But not all Republicans are abolitionists in the 1860s, but they do share opposition to slavery's spread. Now add one more thing to this fire. In October 1859, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is an arsenal in Virginia. Brown believes slavery will only end through violence, and he tries to seize weapons from Harper's Ferry, and he's trying to get local blacks and enslaved blacks around that area to come to the arsenal, and he's going to arm them, and they're going to start a rebellion. John Brown is white. John Brown gets in trouble. Google him sometime, and you can find out all about John Brown. But John Brown, the raid that he does, it fails. No blacks really come to his aid. They don't arm themselves. Brown is captured, he's tried, and he is executed in 1859. And just like with Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks, the North see John Brown as a martyr, and the South see him as proof that abolitionists will attack their society with violence. And trust collapse even further. And that brings us to the election of 1860. So Republicans nominate this young guy named Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln's platform rejects violence, like Brown's raid, but it opposes the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And Democrats are split. So Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas, and Southern Democrats nominate John Breckinridge on a pro-slavery expansion platform. Then there's also this third party that comes up, the Constitutional Union Party nominates John Bell. So you have Democrats splitting into a Northern faction and Southern faction. They've just lost the vote. There's not going to be enough to carry the vote. That is how Lincoln wins without carrying a single Southern state. He doesn't get a Southern state because they're going to go for someone that's pro-slavery. For many white Southerners, that is the breaking point, and they believe slavery's future is threatened, and so secession begins. South Carolina is the first state to leave the Union, and then others follow. And by February of 1861, they form the Confederate States of America. Attempts at a compromise failed. There's the Crittenden Compromise that fails. And when the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter, that's when we kind of mark the beginning right here as the mark of the beginning of the Civil War. Really quickly, Chapter 13 covers the Civil War. You'll learn about the Union's advantages, their disadvantages, the South's advantages, their disadvantages. You'll read about the first major battle at Bull Run. It's a Confederate victory, and it ends in the illusion that the war will be quick. The war continues, enslaved people force the issue of emancipation. When the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in 1863, it does not free a single slave. And it also keeps the idea of slavery in place because it only allegedly frees slaves in places of rebellion. So there are border states that are still slave states. It does not free any slaves in those states. So you'll read all about this, and then at the war's end, this is probably the most important thing, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, that is the biggest one, that one abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment establishes citizenship and gives citizenship back to African Americans. Doesn't give citizenship to Native Americans. That doesn't come until 1924. And then the 15th Amendment sets up for voting. So there's a very quick overview of chapters 12 and 13 for you that will end this course for us. And make sure you complete all the assignments for chapters 12 and 13 before you start the final exam.